The observation deck of Velther Station had no official designation for the hours between second shift and third. The station's central intelligence, a mild-mannered system the crew had collectively named Gerald, simply logged it as low-traffic recreational space and moved on to more pressing calculations, like whether Docking Bay 9's atmospheric seal was developing a personality or merely a persistent leak. Gerald leaned toward personality. Gerald was often wrong. Stella had discovered the deck 14 months ago, on her third night aboard the station, when the diplomatic quarters had felt like a beautifully decorated trap, and her court advisor Marin had knocked on her door 4 times in 2 hours with updates that could have waited until morning. She had walked until she found a room with no one in it and a window the size of a wall, and she had stood there until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to breathe properly. She had returned every week since. It was, in the precise meaning of the word, hers, which made the human standing at the far end of it a problem. He had not heard her enter. He was holding a cup of something warm, judging by the faint curl of vapor rising past his face, and he was looking at the stars with the particular expression of a person who was not thinking about anything urgent. His uniform marked him as Crew Maintenance Division, second class, a rank so thoroughly unremarkable that Stella had to respect it for its consistency. He was simply standing there, belonging to no one's agenda, which was either deeply peaceful or deeply suspicious, depending on how the last 14 months had shaped your instincts. Stella's instincts had been shaped considerably. She considered leaving. The door was still behind her. Gerald had not announced her presence because Gerald was occupied with the docking bay situation, and the man had not turned around. She could withdraw with complete invisibility and return tomorrow when the deck would be empty and correctly hers. This was the logical choice. She was, by training and by temperament, a person who made logical choices. She stayed. She was not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was the silence he carried, which was different from the silence of an empty room in a way she couldn't immediately quantify. Perhaps it was the stars, which were particularly clear tonight, the kind of clear that made the distance feel like a presence rather than an absence. Or perhaps, and she considered this only briefly before setting it aside, she was simply tired of retreating from rooms. She moved to the left side of the window, maintaining a distance that communicated nothing and required nothing, and looked out at the same stars he was looking at. He turned his head slightly at the sound of her footsteps, registered her with a glance that was polite and entirely without theater, and returned to his stars. He did not straighten. He did not introduce himself. He did not say anything at all. Stella found this remarkable. In the past 4 months alone, she had been introduced to Admiral Crescent of the Velurian Outer Fleet, who had delivered a 14-minute address upon first meeting her that included 3 historical references and a metaphor about tides. She had met the gene architect Pieter, who had bowed at a precise angle that his assistant had clearly measured in advance. She had spent an evening with Prince Orvin of the Delian Collective, who expressed all emotion through movement, and had greeted her arrival with something that resembled, spiritually, a weather event. These were distinguished men, accomplished men, men who had arrived at her presence with the full preparation of people who understood that her presence meant something. The man at the end of the window had looked at her the way one looks at a fellow passenger on a transit pod, acknowledged, unthreatening, and entirely not his concern. She looked at him again from the corner of her eye. Medium height, unremarkable posture. The kind of face that would be difficult to describe to someone who hadn't seen it, not because it lacked character, but because its character was quiet. He took a slow sip from his cup, and the vapor rose again, and the stars continued their indifferent burning, and the moment extended itself without any apparent intention of resolving. "Gerald tells me there's a pressure anomaly in the outer seal," she said finally. Not because it was interesting, but because silence, she had discovered, was something you had to earn back once you broke it, and she wanted to know what he would do with words. He considered this for a moment with the gravity it deserved, which was not much. Gerald's been saying that for 3 weeks, he said. At this point I think Gerald just wants someone to talk to. Stella looked out at the stars. The tightness in her chest, the one that had lived there more or less permanently since the suitors had begun arriving in rotating delegations of importance, loosened exactly 1 degree. She did not leave. He told her his name was Gabriel, not because she asked, but because the silence had shifted into the kind that could accommodate small offerings without demanding anything in return. She told him hers was Stella. She did not attach anything else to it. He nodded, as though Stella were a perfectly ordinary name for a person standing in the dark watching stars, which she supposed it was. Maintenance, he said, when she glanced at his uniform in a way that was not subtle. Specifically, I argue with Gerald about the docking bay. Who wins? Gerald usually, but I have the tools, so there's a balance of power. She almost smiled. She caught it and returned it to wherever smiles went when she was in the presence of people she didn't know, which was a habit so old she barely noticed it anymore. Her court advisor Marin had once described Stella's public composure as magnificent. Stella had always privately thought it looked more like someone who had forgotten how their face worked. They stood for another while in the comfortable non-silence that had established itself between them, and Stella let herself simply look at the star field without cataloging anything. This was rarer than it should have been. In court, looking at something meant assessing it. Admiring a view meant understanding its political geography. Even beauty came with a briefing document. Out here, with a maintenance worker who had strong opinions about Gerald and no apparent interest in her bloodline, the stars were just stars, burning at their ancient distances, completely unbothered by the diplomatic situation aboard Velther Station. The diplomatic situation aboard Velther Station was, by any measure, a great deal. It had begun 3 months ago when her mother, Queen Vassara, had transmitted a message so warm and so precisely worded that Stella had known before the second sentence that it contained something she would not enjoy. The Velhari throne had stood for 400 years, her mother had said. Its continuation was a matter not merely of family but of civilization. The assembled systems looked to House Velhari for constancy, for vision, for the particular kind of reassurance that only continuity could provide. And then, after this considerable architecture of context, her mother had arrived at the actual point. 12 suitors, pre-screened, representing alliances of significant strategic value, would be rotating through Velther Station over the coming months. Stella was requested, with love and with the full weight of 4 centuries, to keep an open mind. Stella had kept an open mind. She had kept it open through Admiral Crescen's arrival, which had required 3 cargo bays for his delegation's equipment, and a formal welcome ceremony that Gerald had nearly derailed by announcing, mid-procession, that Bay 9 seal had achieved what Gerald described as a sustained resonance. She had kept it open through the Gene-architect Pieter's visit, during which he had presented her with a bouquet of flowers engineered to release compounds specifically calibrated to promote feelings of warmth and romantic receptivity, which she had accepted graciously, and then quarantined, because she had not survived 14 months on a deep space station by inhaling unvetted chemical compounds from strangers. And she had kept it open, heroically, through 5 days with Prince Orvin of the Delian Collective, who was by all accounts a kind and intelligent man, but who communicated emotional states exclusively through a system of ceremonial movement that his translator had described, with visible personal suffering, as somewhere between classical dance and structural engineering. Orvin had expressed his admiration for her by performing something in the station's reception hall that had taken 40 minutes and required 2 load-bearing columns. She had applauded. She had meant it, in the way one means applause for something genuinely impressive that one never wants to experience again. "You're not from the diplomatic corps," Gabriel said. It was not a question exactly. More an observation offered without pressure, the way one might note that the star field was particularly unobstructed tonight. "What makes you say that?" Diplomatic corps people don't stand this quietly. They're always filing something internally. He tapped his temple once, indicating the faint line of a neural interface. You can tell. Their eyes move differently. Stella considered this. Her own interface was higher grade than anything standard crew carried, woven into her nervous system before she could form the memory of it being done. And she had spent years learning to keep her expressions independent of whatever it was processing. That he had noticed the absence of the tell, rather than its presence, meant he was more observant than his rank suggested and less interested in using that observation than most people she knew. I'm attached to the Velhari delegation, she said. This was accurate. It was also the most load-bearing understatement she had produced in recent memory. He accepted it the way he seemed to accept most things without requiring it to be more than it was. Long posting, he asked. It feels that way sometimes. He nodded slowly, looking back at the glass. Gerald says the same thing. I told him he's a station. He said that wasn't the point. A pause. Gerald has opinions. The tightness eased another degree. Outside, a cargo hauler drifted past the window at the patient speed of something with no particular deadline, its running lights blinking in a rhythm that had nothing to do with urgency, and Stella watched it until it passed beyond the edge of the glass and was gone. She stayed until Gerald dimmed the deck lights to their late-cycle setting, which was Gerald's version of a polite suggestion. She left without ceremony. Gabriel raised his cup slightly as she went, which was not a bow and not a dismissal, and was somehow exactly right. She came back the following evening. He was there when she arrived, which she had not expected, and which she therefore did not react to in any visible way, because she was excellent at not reacting to things she had not expected. She took her usual position at the left side of the window. He took his at the right. Gerald hummed somewhere in the walls with the contentment of a system that had recently had its Bay 9 theory validated by a third-party diagnostic, and outside the glass the stars performed their ancient, indifferent constancy. Gerald's winning, Gabriel said by way of greeting. The seal. Developed a frequency, Gerald's calling it a signature. A pause. Gerald is insufferable when he's right. Stella looked out at the dark. How often is he right? More than the engineering team wants to admit, less than Gerald claims. He considered his cup. It balances out. This was, she had come to understand over the past several evenings, how Gabriel spoke. In small, considered pieces, without the architecture of performance that most people built around their words when they were in the presence of someone they wanted something from. He did not want anything from her. This remained, 11 days into their quiet occupation of the observation deck, the most disorienting thing about him. The suitors wanted things. This was not a criticism. It was simply the condition of their presence. Admiral Crescent wanted an alliance that would reposition his fleet's supply lines through Velhari space. Pieter wanted the scientific legitimacy that a royal connection could confer on his work. Orvin, she suspected, wanted primarily to choreograph the wedding, which in Delian tradition was a 3-day movement piece requiring a cast of hundreds. These were not base motivations. They came wrapped in genuine regard, in real intelligence, in the kind of appeal that made her understand exactly why her mother had assembled them. The problem was not what they wanted. The problem was that she could always see it, precise and unmistakable, sitting behind their eyes like a second agenda sharing office space with the first. Gabriel's eyes, when he looked at her, contained nothing she could identify as agenda. They contained mild interest, occasional amusement, and once, during a conversation about Gerald's expanding theory of his own sentience, something that looked very much like the same exhaustion she felt when the diplomatic machinery required her to care deeply about something she did not care about at all. She had found this unexpectedly companionable. He filed a formal request, Gabriel said. Stella turned slightly. Gerald. For recognition, as a semi-autonomous cognitive entity. He said this with the tone of a man reading a document he had not expected to receive. 3 pages, cited 7 precedents, used the word personhood 4 times. What did Station Command say? They forwarded it to the legal subdivision. The legal subdivision forwarded it to the ethics board. The ethics board sent Gerald a form to complete. He paused. Gerald completed the form and appended a 14-page addendum questioning the philosophical legitimacy of the form itself. Stella felt the smile reach her face before she could redirect it, and for once she did not. It stayed, brief and unguarded, and Gabriel noticed it the way he noticed most things without making anything of it, which paradoxically made it mean more. Outside, a science vessel she didn't recognize moved through the middle distance. Its sensor arrays extended like the careful arms of something trying to understand what it was touching. Velther Station sat at the edge of the Karen expanse, which was the polite diplomatic name for a region of space that 5 different civilizations had claimed, argued over, partially mapped, and ultimately agreed to share in the way that people share something none of them entirely understand. The station existed as a kind of punctuation mark in that agreement, a place where the sentence of the treaty paused before continuing. It was why her mother had placed the suitor rotation here. Neutral ground, technically. Symbolically rich. The sort of location that made proposals feel historic. It was also, Stella had discovered, very far from anything that felt like home. "Can I ask you something?" she said, and it came out less like a question and more like a thing she was already doing. "You can try," Gabriel said, which was neither permission nor deflection but something that sat evenly between them. "When you look at someone, do you—" She stopped, reorganized. "Do you find it difficult not to want something from them?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had miscalculated, had pushed past the comfortable boundary of their deck silences into something he would not follow her into. But he was not discomfited. He was thinking, which she recognized because it looked different from hesitation. "I think wanting things from people is pretty standard," he said finally. "I think the problem is when you stop seeing the person and only see what they could give you." He looked at the glass. Hard to actually talk to someone when you're mostly talking to the version of them you've already decided exists. Stella said nothing. Below the observation deck, somewhere in the deep infrastructure of the station, Gerald was almost certainly updating a file, running a calculation, or composing another philosophical challenge to an administrative form that had not asked for one. The stars held their positions with characteristic reliability. The science vessel completed its slow transit and disappeared into the dark of the expanse, reaching carefully forward into the thing it didn't yet understand. She stayed until Gerald dimmed the lights. She left thinking about the version of herself that every other room on the station had already decided existed, and how long it had been since anyone had looked past it to see if anyone was standing behind it. The suitors had a schedule. Stella had not made the schedule. Marin had made the schedule, with the focused intensity of someone who believed that civilization was essentially a time management problem. But Stella lived inside it the way one lives inside a structure that has been built around you while you were looking elsewhere. Mornings were for formal engagements. Afternoons held cultural exchanges, diplomatic briefings, and on Tuesdays, a recurring session her schedule described as open dialogue, which meant, in practice, that several very important people talked at her in a coordinated sequence. This particular morning belonged to Admiral Crescent. He arrived with the precise punctuality of a man who considered tardiness a form of aggression, accompanied by 2 aides whose primary function appeared to be standing at angles that made him look important. He was, genuinely, an impressive figure, tall, decorated, with the kind of bearing that came from decades of commanding things that could destroy other things. He spoke about the geopolitical architecture of the outer systems with a fluency that Stella actually respected. He had read everything about her that was publicly available and several things that were not. He looked at her with the full attention of a man who had decided she was worth the preparation, which she understood was meant to be flattering, and which landed instead like a very sophisticated appraisal. Halfway through his third point about Velhari's position relative to the current trade corridors, Stella's neural interface flagged an incoming message from Gerald. She kept her expression perfectly calibrated to attentive as she read it peripherally. It said, Bay 9's signature has developed a secondary harmonic. I am choosing to interpret this as growth. G. She returned to the Admiral's third point. That afternoon, Piotr requested a brief meeting to present what he described as a small gesture. The small gesture turned out to be a custom-engineered plant that grew in real time, its cellular structure designed to produce, over approximately 4 hours, a bloom in the exact spectral frequency of the Velhari royal color. He had calculated the growth rate from the moment of presentation so that it would reach full bloom at the end of their scheduled time together. Stella watched it on the table between them as he spoke about his work, about the intersection of biological science and beauty, about what it meant to make something living that was also, in some precise sense, a statement. It was extraordinary. It was also, she thought, a conversation she was not part of. The plant was a message sent through her rather than to her, addressed to the Crown, to the Alliance, to some future arrangement that had her name on it. She admired it honestly and felt, behind the admiration, the familiar distance. Marin caught her in the corridor afterward, falling into step beside her with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. Cressen's aide submitted a formal expression of the Admiral's continued interest, Marin said, consulting her interface with the efficiency of someone for whom information was a form of nutrition. Piotr's team sent a follow-up cultural brief, and Prince Orvan has requested an additional evening, which his translator has described as, she paused, in the way that Marin only paused when the next thing she had to say required personal fortitude, a chamber piece. Apparently, it requires the observation deck. Stella stopped walking. My observation deck. The station's observation deck, Marin said, with the careful precision of someone who had noticed the possessive and chosen not to address it. He's reserved it for the evening. The request was properly filed. Gerald approved it. A beat. Gerald also asked Orvan's team for an artist's statement which they provided, and which Gerald has apparently appended to his own personhood file as supporting evidence. Stella looked at the corridor wall for a moment. It was a good wall. It had never asked anything of her. When? She asked. 3rd hour of 2nd shift. She did that calculation quickly and quietly. Gabriel's usual time on the deck was the 1st hour of 2nd shift. If he followed his pattern, and he was, she had come to understand, a man of reliable patterns, he would be gone before Orvan arrived. The deck would be empty for precisely the window Orvan needed. Everything would proceed as scheduled. What she did not examine was why this felt like a narrow corridor rather than an open field. She went to the deck at the start of 2nd shift. Gabriel was there, cup in hand, looking at the stars with his characteristic absence of urgency. She stood beside him and said nothing for a while, and the station hummed, and Gerald's secondary harmonic presumably continued its growth. Orvan has the deck tonight, she said eventually. Gabriel received this information calmly. The prince, the one who... Yes. How long? Gerald has the reservation as 2 hours. She paused. His translator filed a costume manifest. There are 17 pieces. Gabriel looked at the stars. Gerald must be thrilled. Gerald asked for program notes. A silence that had warmth in it. He's not a bad person, Stella said, and meant it entirely. None of them are. Gabriel didn't say anything, which she had come to understand was not indifference. It was the specific silence of someone who was listening past the words to what was underneath them. She had met very few people in her life who listened that way. In her experience, most people listened to the words and prepared their response, and the actual person speaking moved through the exchange like a signal through a wire, transmitted, but not really touched. She watched the stars and felt, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, the difference between being assessed and being heard. The cargo routes beyond the glass ran their indifferent commerce. Somewhere in the walls, Gerald hummed at 2 frequencies now, and seemed by every available measure entirely content. Orvin's chamber piece had, according to Gerald's post-event log, lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, incorporated all 17 costume pieces, and at one point caused a minor gravitational sensor alert when the prince executed what his translator afterward described as the moment of profound longing. Gerald had filed the sensor alert, cross-referenced it with the artist's statement, and added a footnote to his personhood document, arguing that the capacity to be moved by art was a marker of consciousness. Gerald had not, technically, been moved by the art. Gerald had simply found it useful. Marin delivered the debrief the following morning with the expression of a woman who had witnessed things she was still organizing internally. The 17 costumes, she explained, represented 17 emotional states in the Delian philosophical tradition. Orvin had moved through them in sequence, each transition marked by a specific movement that his translator had rendered, with evident personal strain, into a summary that read less like a translation and more like a cry for help. The evening had concluded with a gesture directed at the empty observation window that Orvin's people described as an offering to the absent, which was, apparently, the Delian way of saying something to someone who was not in the room. Stella listened to all of this and felt, beneath the genuine warmth she held for Orvin's sincerity, a quiet and specific guilt. He had performed an offering to the absent because she had been absent. She had been absent because she had been on the lower deck's secondary observation point, a narrow maintenance corridor with a small porthole and no chairs, where Gabriel had located her after finding the main deck reserved, and where they had sat on the floor for 2 hours talking about nothing that mattered and everything that did. She had not told Marin this. She was thinking about whether she needed to when Marin said, with the particular care of someone placing something fragile on a surface, "You seem different lately." Stella looked at her interface, where Gerald had just flagged a new message. The secondary harmonic has a tertiary component. I want to be clear that I consider this a development, not a complication. Gee. Different how? Stella said. Less compressed, Marin said, which was not a word Stella had expected and which landed with uncomfortable accuracy. You've been, she searched for it, present, in a different way than usual. Stella said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer, and Marin, who had known her long enough to read silences the way other people read text, did not press it. She moved on to the day's schedule with the professional grace of someone who had stored the observation somewhere careful and would return to it later. The day's schedule included a joint cultural briefing with Crescent and 2 of his senior officers, a formal tea with Pieter that had somehow expanded to include 3 of his research colleagues, and a message from Orvin's translator that began with a paragraph of context before arriving at its actual content, which was an invitation to view Orvin's preparatory sketches for a follow-up piece he was tentatively calling Persistence of Hope. Stella sent a warm reply. She meant it. She also took a slightly longer route to the cultural briefing, one that passed through the maintenance corridor where she and Gabriel had sat on the floor, and found that she was looking at the small porthole differently than she had looked at any window in months. Gabriel was not there, which she had not expected. She kept walking. He was on the main deck that evening in his usual position, and she understood from the angle of his shoulders that he had spent the day doing something physically demanding and was now engaged in the serious work of not thinking about it. She had come to read him in small ways, the cup held differently when he was tired, the silence with a different texture when something had been frustrating. She was not sure when she had started cataloging these things. She suspected it had been early. Gerald's at 3 harmonics, he said when she reached her side of the window. I heard. He sent me a message. Gabriel turned slightly. Gerald's messaging you now. Since last week. Mostly updates on the harmonic situation. Once, a question about whether I thought ambition was an inherent quality or a developed one. She paused. I think he was asking for the personhood document. What did you tell him? That I thought it was both, depending on what you were reaching for. Gabriel was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Karen expanse held its complicated, disputed dark, full of things that 5 civilizations had agreed not to fully claim. She had been thinking about that lately, about what it meant to agree not to fully claim something, whether it was wisdom or simply a shared unwillingness to do the difficult thing. Marin noticed something, Stella said. She was not sure why she was telling him this. She told him anyway. What did she notice? That I'm less compressed. She considered the word again, her word. He looked at the glass for a moment. Is she wrong? Stella thought about the maintenance corridor floor and the small porthole, and 2 hours of conversation that had moved through Gerald's philosophical ambitions and the specific loneliness of deep space postings, and whether the Karen expanse was beautiful or just vast, which were not. She had realized midway through such different questions. No, she said. He nodded slowly, in the way he nodded when something confirmed what he had already understood, and he did not feel the need to perform surprise about it. Her long ears, which she managed in every other room on the station with the habitual composure of someone who had learned early that visibility was a variable you controlled, had been entirely unmanaged for the past 3 weeks on the observation deck. She had not noticed until this moment. He had not once remarked on them. She stood with this fact for a while and found that it had weight, not the weight of the unremarked thing, but the weight of a person who had looked at her and simply seen her, without the need to make anything of what they saw. The 3 harmonics hummed in the walls. The stars burned at their ancient distances. Stella looked out at the expanse and felt, with a precision that was almost frightening, that she was standing at the edge of something she had already decided to step into. Gerald sent her a message at the start of second shift that read, "I have reached 4 harmonics. I want you to know that I consider this a threshold moment. I have updated my personhood document accordingly. I also want to note, for the record, that I have observed your deck attendance patterns over the past several weeks and have chosen not to include this data in any official log. I am exercising discretion. I believe discretion is a marker of personhood. G." Stella read it twice, standing in her quarters, already dressed for the evening. She sent back, "Thank you, Gerald." Then, after a moment, she added, "For all of it." Gerald replied within 3 seconds with a single line, "I know," which was either very moving or very Gerald, and she had come to understand those were not mutually exclusive. Marin was waiting in the corridor, which Stella had expected, with the expression of someone who had been thinking carefully about something, and had arrived at the point where thinking about it was no longer sufficient. "The formal rotation concludes in 4 days, Marin said, not as a warning, as a fact laid gently on a surface between them. "I know," Stella said. "Crescent's aide has requested a timeline. Pieter's team submitted a second cultural brief, which I believe is a gesture of optimism. Orvin," Marin paused in the way she only paused now when Orvin's translator was involved, "has completed persistence of hope and is requesting a private viewing. His translator's message was 6 paragraphs long, and I want you to know, I read all 6 of them on your behalf. I'll send him a response personally," Stella said. And she meant this, because Orvin deserved that much, deserved the real version of her attention, even if what she was about to give him was not what he had spent 17 costume changes hoping for. Marin looked at her for a moment with the steady eyes of someone who had known her across many rooms and many versions of the performance she gave in each one. "You've already decided," Marin said. "It was not a question." "I've been deciding for 3 weeks," Stella said. "I finished today." Marin was quiet for a beat that contained, Stella thought, a great many things: professional recalculation, personal loyalty, and somewhere underneath both of them, something that looked, if you knew where to look, like relief. "Your mother will have thoughts," Marin said finally. "My mother always has thoughts. That's never been the problem." She looked at the corridor, the clean, functional lines of it, the station's practical beauty that had nothing to prove. The problem was that I kept treating her thoughts as the conclusion instead of the beginning. Marin absorbed this. Then she said, with the tone of someone making a note they intend to keep, "I'll need to draft some communications." "Tomorrow," Stella said. "Tonight I need the deck." She arrived earlier than usual. The deck was empty when she came in, which gave her a few minutes alone with the window and the stars and the Carrant expanse, which lay out beyond the glass in all its complicated, unclaimed dark. She thought about what it meant to choose something in full knowledge of its complications. The expanse had been disputed for generations because every civilization that looked at it saw something different: resource, border, mystery, threat. The treaty that had established Velthor Station had not resolved those differences. It had simply created a place where people could stand in proximity to them without immediately reaching for something sharp. She had been standing in proximity to something for 3 weeks. She was done using that as a reason not to reach. Gabriel arrived at his usual time, noticed her earlier presence without remarking on it, and took his position at the right side of the window. He was not holding his cup, which she had learned meant the day had gone in a direction that had not left him with patience for waiting for things to cool. She noted this and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of language. They stood in their parallel silence, and she let it have its full weight because it deserved that. It had earned that. This silence was not empty. It was the most furnished silence she had ever stood in, full of 3 weeks of evenings and maintenance corridors and Gerald's philosophical dispatches, and the small, reliable fact of him turning up. "The formal rotation ends in 4 days, she said, looking at the glass. "I know," he said. Gerald announced it station-wide, with a brief personal reflection on impermanence. He included a footnote, she added, suggesting that the ability to anticipate loss was evidence of emotional depth, which he filed under the personhood document. Subsection 4, she confirmed. A pause that had warmth all the way through it. Then, "I've been weighing something." He said nothing. This was the correct response, and they both understood it. "There are 12 suitors," she said. "Distinguished, capable people with genuine cases for why an alliance with my house would be meaningful. My court assembled them carefully. My mother approves of all of them." She looked at the dark. "They are everything the situation calls for." He waited. She turned then, fully, the way she had not turned in any of the previous evenings, and looked at him directly. The station's late-cycle light fell across her face, and she did not manage anything. Not her expression, not her composure, not the long ears she had spent years making invisible in rooms that required her to be a symbol before she was a person. She let herself be entirely visible, which was the most exposed she had stood in longer than she could easily calculate. "Everyone wants me," she said, plainly, in the voice of someone who had finished weighing something and arrived at the only answer that felt like the truth. "But I choose you, human." Gabriel looked at her. Not at the crown she wasn't wearing, or the civilization she represented, or the strategic value her house carried across 6 systems. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the very first evening, as a person standing at a window, belonging to no one's agenda, present in the specific and sufficient way of someone who had decided the moment they were in was worth being in. He was quiet for long enough to be genuine. Then he said, "That's a significant statement to make to someone you've only ever seen drink tea." She felt the smile reach her face, and this time did not consider redirecting it at all. "I've also seen you argue with Gerald. Gerald usually wins." "So I've heard." She looked at him steadily. "Well." He set down the cup he wasn't holding, reached, that is, for the familiar gesture and found it absent, and let his hands settle at his sides instead, which was somehow more honest than any practiced response could have been. "I think," he said carefully, "that choosing something real over something convenient is either very brave or very complicated." "It's both," she said, "depending on what you're reaching for." He recognized his own words return to him, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not with the theater of a man performing a moment, but with the quiet movement of someone who has just understood that a conversation they thought was about Gerald was also, all along, about this. "All right," he said, simply. Completely. Outside, the Karen expanse held its ancient, disputed dark, full of things 5 civilizations had agreed not to fully claim. Inside the walls, Gerald hummed at 4 harmonics, each one a frequency he had named and tended and chosen to call growth. The stars burned at their distances without asking anyone's permission. And on the observation deck of Velther Station, in the last minutes before Gerald dimmed the lights, 2 people stood at the window in a silence that needed nothing added to it, because it was, at last, entirely complete.